I think it's important that we can identify with these presentations that they're going to be beneficial to yourself. So I named it, it's your soil, observe it, smell it, know it, and build it. And Hugh has been one of my mentors, and that's another thing I'd like to say, is when you start on any journey in life, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Find someone who's done it or a mentor and follow them. And as I say, all the people that I've asked over these 3 days are people who've influenced my life. We have a broadcast tower on Milgadara that Cam showed, which emits the preps. Plus I have a radionics instrument with the patterns of energy for the BD preps that I can broadcast as well. Hugh is probably one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met. Is that an astrophysicist? Is that correct?
Biochemist.
Biochemist. Pretty amazing mind. And he's been a mentor to many biological farmers throughout Australia, the US, and he's an author as well of a book called The Biodynamic Farm. Did you bring some of those, Hugh, with you?
No, I think you've got a...
I've got some up there. Yeah.
You can get it from Amazon cheaper than I can buy it.
It's amazing. And he's written hundreds of soil science, farming, radionics, and biochemical sequencing soil articles. So Hugh will cover a topic that confuses farmers of what to apply and when, as well as how plants grow naturally. Hugh's insights will assist with learning how to move forward with sustainable agriculture. I'd like to welcome Hugh Lovel.
Thank you, Rhonda. I'd have to say I'm very proud of Rhonda and Bill for the progress they've made. I've known Rhonda now 8 years, and she was already on this track when I first met her and was fixing to jump off into composting. And I encouraged her, and I'm so glad that she found a mentor that knew actually what good compost was. And so she's gone straight to the top of the class in compost making. So, and I guess that's one of the reasons that I'm here is I recognized very early on what a good compost she was making. And that's because I started out in this game farming myself, and I made all sorts of bad compost. And I kept working at it until I made good compost. And it was a real learning curve, and I hope most of you don't have to repeat all that. The name of my company is Quantum Agriculture, and that's partly because very early on with my background in scientific education, I realized that things like biodynamics and radionics were working with quantum non-locality and entanglement, and that what Cam said about your intent, that intent actually has a big influence. In the early days of quantum physics, it was realized that the observer and the phenomenon are inseparably linked. And previous to that, it was believed that the observer had absolutely no influence over the phenomena. So science, physics, and chemistry and all the rest of this has come a long ways in the past 100 years in realizing that actually our thoughts influence what we see on the scientific side of things. So let's see if I can figure out how this works here. There we go. Okay, I've put a few slides in my presentation here just to give us an idea of the scale, the big picture of where our soils come from. And this is a star-forming region of the heavens, I guess you'd call it. And a vortex will form in that region, and you'll get it to draw in some of the dust and gravel and so forth in space. And it'll compress, and as you know anything about compression, you get a lot of heat generated in that compression. And in the formation of a solar system such as our own, then things are formed in that vortexial fashion, and around the equator of the sun, the solar vortex, is where we find the planets. Now in planet formation, this is a picture, an artist's impression, of what would have been happening in the very early days of the formation of our planet. All sorts of things, the garbage of space, the detritus of previous supernova explosions and so forth, is drawn in and it compresses into a planet. And in the cooling of this planet, the lighter elements tend to cook upwards out of what we think of as the core and the mantle of the Earth. Then our silica, as an element, it percolates upward. And if you know anything about fossicking and so forth, the only thing that brings the gold up in geological formations is silica. Silica rises, it's a very light element, and it rises to the surface, and over 50% of our planetary land surface is silica. So silicon is very, very important, and it's the carrier actually of all of our heavier metals. This is a picture here. Early on, sometime in the Earth's evolution, the moon apparently separated from the Earth. And it's a thought that it separated out of the Pacific Basin, and then the supercontinent broke up and sort of like enclosed that Pacific Basin in forming what we now know as the continents or land masses of the Earth. And atmosphere formed, of course, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, which combines with oxygen to make moisture. These gaseous elements then rose above the surface of the Earth and formed the atmosphere. And cooling, and eventually then there was surface water on the Earth, and we got oceans and mountains. And there was erosion and deserts, and of course, in the erosion, a lot of the material that eroded broke down, floated down river channels. You can see some of those here. This pointer doesn't seem to have a very big red dot, but that formed our river deltas and some of the most fertile soils on the Earth. Also, glaciation was a big factor in the grinding up of rocks and so forth into soil. And these also flowed down from glaciers into sedimentation zones and formed alluvial soils and river deltas. And forestation, also, plants dug into, this is a mountain and it's completely forested, and the trees have covered it, and the living organisms, plants, are very good about getting their roots into rocks. You see trees growing on some very improbable places, and they get their roots in there and they crack the rocks open and they retain moisture and they secrete acids and so forth, and they form more soils. I was very impressed up in Forsyth, Queensland, to see my first kapok trees. And these are trees, they don't have a very long life, but they grow on rocky outcroppings, and they're a wonderful, like a humus forming sort of a tree, and they build soil, and they build it on the rocky ridges, and then it erodes down from there. So plants do some very amazing things. Tropical rainforests. When I first migrated to Australia, that's where I lived, was up in Toga on the edges of tropical rainforests. And they're also very big influences on the development of soils. Fungal mycelia, you will see in the microbial world in the soil, anything that produces filaments or hair-like structures such as fungi is predominantly a silica-based organism. And I'm going to emphasize silica a lot in my presentation today and on Friday because I think it's been overlooked. It's been considered to be non-essential, but it's known to be beneficial. And one of the reasons it's never been considered essential is we haven't been able to exclude it from the growing media and prove that plants can't grow without it. If we could exclude it, then I think we would see that plants can't grow without it. And I would consider it not just beneficial, but essential. But fungi, which use oxygen very efficiently, and they can actually oxidize rocks, and they'll oxidize particles in the soil and release nutrients, and they hang on to it. Your bacteria are not particularly renowned for hanging on to the nutrients of the soil, but the fungi hang on to everything. Actinomycetes. When I studied soil microbiology as part of my biochemistry curriculum back in 1972, my professor made a big point out of how important actinomycetes are in the soil. They produce that smell of good, clean soil, but they're also the source of many of the antibiotics that we find in use in medicine, and they actually dampen down rampant and would be pathogenic bacteria in the soil. So they tie up nutrients and they keep the soil fresh and alive and clean. And if you see their little hair-like structures here, they're predominantly siliceous microorganisms, and they can actually, with those hairs, break into the clay humus complexes in the soil and extract the silica, break down the colloid, and release any nutrients that are there. They're also a host zone. When you see this root exudation, this rhizosphere that Dr. Stapper was mentioning, they are the area where the plant is putting out its sugars. I happened to get a picture of this one because it came out on the surface of something and you could actually see those hairs. But that's that zone that forms the rhizosphere, and that's the home, the habitat for all your nitrogen fixers, phosphorus solubilizers, and mineral cation releasers. So your exchangeable cations and all the rest of that is going on in this root zone here, where these microorganisms are forming the habitat for everything else that occurs. Humus, it's a poorly understood subject in soil science and in composting. Time and time again I encounter people saying, oh, compost, that's broken down organic matter and you break it down and form humus. Well, when you break down something like cellulose, cellulose is a polymer, a chain, glucose. It's just a chain sugar. And when you break it down, you break it back down into those sugars. And they're very simple carbon structures. And humic acids are very, very complex. To characterize what any specific humic acid is a project a friend of mine in Las Cruces, New Mexico, has been working with the national laboratories at Los Alamos to characterize the structures of humus, but it's basically classified as humus because it's a very, very large carbon molecule complex. And it has a lot of other things tucked in, amongst which are amino acids. There would also be phosphates, there would be sulfates. There are other anions besides the nitrogen anions. And then also you have your cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, etc., adhere to these humus molecules. And they form a complex with the clay, the aluminum silicates in the soil. So actually humus has to be built up by microbial activity after the breakdown of organic matter occurs. And you'll see this here in this seminar, that there's a lot of attention paid not just to the breaking down of organic matter, but to the rebuilding of those organic chemicals, those organic complexes, into humus that's stable, that retains the nutrient elements in the soil. So this is a very, very important concept in the building of soils, is humification. Now in grasslands, grasses are particularly, they're siliceous plants. And they're very efficient at photosynthesis. And the reason for this is silica is the basis of all your capillary activity in the plant, and that's your transport. And when a ray of light hits the leaf in the chloroplast, and it bumps the chlorophyll up into a little bit more energetic state, then it transfers electrons through adenosine diphosphate, bumps it up into adenosine triphosphate, and that has to travel in the plant to where the sugar is made. It has to go from the chloroplast to where the sugar is made. And because grasses have such an efficient, they're so siliceous, they have very fast and efficient transport system, then they're able to get the energy from the chloroplast into making sugar, move it along faster than any other kind of plant. So your most efficient sugar-making plants are grasses. Sugar cane's a good example. Maize is a pretty good example too, and it'll make a great tonnage of organic matter. So your grasslands are the plants, these are the kinds of plants that are able to feed energy into the soil, and nitrogen fixation is an intensely energy-consuming process. And so these plants, the grasses particularly, which are very good hosts for your actinomycetes, then they're able to build soil, build humus into the soil. Now there's every other kind of plant in this grassland. There's thistles here, which are not such a bad plant when you come and think about it. And there's a wide variety of other plants, umbellifers and crucifers and so on and so forth. There's a large community of plants, and every kind of plant excretes a different flavor of root exudates into the soil and hosts a different mix of microorganisms. I think Dr. Stafford said it takes at least 15,000 different varieties of microorganisms in the soil for it to become self-fertile. So we're talking about a very large community of microorganisms, each of which is doing a little bit different sort of a job, and they're contributing their efforts together. Culturally, we think that the winning strategy is uniformity and competition. We learn this in our sports, in our schools, so on and so forth. But nature shows us that diversity and cooperation are far more powerful, and that they create a surplus in the balance of things in the household of nature. So what we see in a grassland like this is we see a great deal of diversity and a lot of cooperation, and this actually builds soil. Now there's also wind erosion, and it deposits dust. Dust collects very well on these grassy plains. And what we see in a place like the Liverpool Plains is we see a place where grassland has caught dust and built up some very deep soils And we would find that the Serengeti Plains in Africa, the steppes of Central Asia, the Great Plains in North America and so forth, were built up in large part by catching dust from wind erosion. And if you remember back here just a few years back where we had dust storms coming up out of Central Australia, deposited in a day an inch of soil on the streets of Sydney, then this is not to be ignored. So keeping a cover of dense grass is a soil building process. And grazing recycles that organic matter and allows the sunshine to hit the roots of the grass, and a new cycle of growth will occur. Plus you get the manuring, and there's many things that happen in that process that build humus. So grazing, you would find that on the Serengeti Plains in Africa, there's the greatest diversity of grazing animals anywhere in the world. And this is some of the world's most fertile soil right on the equator. The North American Great Plains, likewise, the herds of bison and so forth, were tremendously important in the building of those soils. So here's another example of what can happen on more tilted or sloped land. This is a pasture that's been terraced by grazing. And you can see that if it rains on this paddock here, that the erosion will be slowed, the runoff of water will be slowed, and in fact, where you should have a gully here if it was smooth, there's actually a buildup here, and the cows have trampled it so that there's actually a terracing going on that occurs naturally. And I've seen in places like Gippsland and whatnot where the farmers have actually taken their equipment and smoothed out all of that terracing that's been done by the cattle and sped up the runoff. Very strange thing to do in a drought-prone environment, but that's cleaned up their paddocks and made them look all nice and smooth. We really ought to pay attention to things like that, because that's actually a mistake, and we should learn from our mistakes. One of the most important animals in the building of soils is ants, and they're fungal farmers. And you can see here in this picture where these ants have gone down and mined clay, brought it up in little tiny bits. They've mined things and brought them up, and ants are very sensitive to the flavors of things, and they know when they're looking for a certain mineral. They know how to identify it, and they'll bring it up, and in those caps there, that's actually a soil building process where they're bringing, oftentimes in very sandy soils, you'll see the ant heaps, these little cones, are where the ants have gone down sometimes 10 or 15 meters and brought clay up to build the topsoil. So ants are very, very important in that process, and it also illustrates the importance of clay, which is aluminium silicate, in the development of fungi, because fungi are siliceous organisms, and they really depend to a high extent on the clay and the silica sands in the soil for their source of silica. Earthworms, they also build soil, and earthworms don't have any teeth, so they're kind of like a chook, and they have to find bits of grit and eat those because they've got a gizzard instead. And in grinding up the seeds and other tough bits that they ingest in their gizzards, then they're grinding up particles in the soil, very small particles, but they're grinding them up into dust in their gizzards. So I'm told these meter-long earthworms that Cam was talking about, that they exist up in my area up there in Gyra on the New England tablelands, And they're known as granite worms because they live in the granite bouldery areas where nobody can plow it. And so they haven't cleaned them up like Cam's father did. And so they're still hanging out there in that bouldery granite country, and they're known as granite worms. Well, they like granite, I can tell you. We had earthworms where I farmed in Georgia called Canadian night crawlers, and they weren't a meter long, but they were still quite big. And they loved granite dust from the local granite quarry, which was making road-based material. And they would just really thrive on that. So I know that earthworms really like to have that good grit from freshly crushed granite. Here's another really important soil building animal, dung beetles. They will take that cow manure, it could be bison dung, it could be elephant dung, but they will take this. There's no doubt there's hundreds of different varieties, and there's a variety for your season, your temperature, your soils at just about any time of the year. And the name is not on the tip of my tongue, but we had one of the leading dung beetle researchers in the world down in Victoria, and he's retired just a few years back. But he's been a very big leader. Somebody, I'm sure Dr. Stapper or somebody else here will know who he is. Say that again?
Oh, there are two people. John Fian in Canberra.
John Fian.
Yeah.
Okay. There's another fellow. There's another one, and the other one's the one I've met. It doesn't ring a bell yet. But we're fortunate here in Australia to have some very good science on the subject here. What dung beetles will do is they burrow down into the soil and they bring up soil and mix it into the manure, and they bring manure down into the soil, which is where they lay their eggs. And so they're actually mixing up soil with manure. If you understand about compost and humification, you really need some soil for the humification process to proceed, because humic acids don't really form on their own. They're clay humus complexes. And so in the formation of humus, then that mixing up of soil with organic things like manure is a very important part. And dung beetles do this for free. They work as volunteers, and we should encourage them. Now, in the soil building story on this planet, humans are pretty recent interveners. And this is a dairy feed wagon on a feed pad in Tasmania. And these people are going to be in the business of composting. And they really got into dairy cows in order to rebuild their soils because they were potato farmers. Oh, they grew potatoes, and they grew onions, and they grew poppies and so forth. But they were actually farming produce and that sort of thing, and it wears the soils out pretty quick, and they got into dairying as a way to keep their soils alive. And now they're getting into composting because they realize that not only can they keep their soils alive with dairying, they can actually build soils faster with dairying than with any other kind of farming. In the last century, since the Haber process was discovered or invented back in 1907, we have become dependent on nitrogen fertilizers. And one of the things that Cam was pointing out was that with the use of anhydrous ammonia, and this is an anhydrous ammonia plant, with the use of anhydrous ammonia, he was able to burn up soils faster than any other way. known to man. So we've injected the soils with nitrogen ammonia gas, and it takes 10 units of methane to make 1 unit of ammonia. So it's a very energy consuming process. And then when we inject it into the soil, it hardens the soil up like a brick, and then as it oxidizes to the nitrate. And in this process, it's also burning up carbon in the soil. So it, you might say, scalds the biology of the soil. It got rid of Cam's meter-long earthworms. And in that process, it breaks down the humic acids, and it releases all of those things that are being held in those insoluble but available humic forms in the soil. So initially, it gives a real whiz-bang effect. So it's releasing such things as copper and zinc and particularly boron and so forth, and it makes a flush in the soil, and the plants get the benefit of this. But in the process, the nitrates also leach those elements, and the soil wears out very rapidly. And so we've got a situation in the world today. You can see here, this darkest color here is very degraded soil, and then it goes towards lighter colors. This is just degraded, and then over here the blonde is stable soil. And we're very lucky. Australia is the lucky country, no doubt about it, because you see the highly degraded soil here is actually a very small area in Australia. We've got degraded soil, we've got plenty of that, but highly degraded soil, we really haven't gotten to that state in very many places in Australia. So we're not that bad off. If you looked at the United States, for example, where I came from, then the proportion of highly degraded soil is actually much greater than Australia. We sort of pat ourselves on the back that we've got such worn out soils in Australia, but actually it's not so. Actually, our soils aren't that degraded yet. That's something to think about. Now, I've spent nearly 40 years in agriculture, and I started out being a real heretic, and now I'm in the company of all these other heretics like Carolyn and Martin and Cam and so forth, and there's more to come, Graham Sate and so forth. So the heresy has become the accepted message at this point, and I don't have to argue the scientific validity of what I was doing back there almost 40 years ago. Of course, a lot of what I was doing back then was learning from my mistakes, because although I knew back then that people in this room here would have grandchildren or great-grandchildren that would say, "Grandpa, why did people ever put poison on food?" And we'd have to answer that. I'd studied biochemistry, and I'd gotten out of that field because I can remember my advisor saying, I told him, I says, I don't want to have to work in this industry where everything is poison. And he says, oh, you could teach. And I said, hold on. I says, every chemistry professor on the faculty is missing days because of health problems. I says, every time I go in and out of the lab building, There's toluene and there's benzene and there's every other kind of chemical poison in the air that I'm breathing. And I stumble out of the lab in the afternoon and trip on cracks in the sidewalk. I says, I don't want to be a part of that. And when I got into agriculture, there was no doubt in my military mind, not that I'm that military, but there was no doubt in my mind that I wasn't going to put poison on the soil. There had to be a better way. And I had people tell me, oh, me and my dad, we tried this organic stuff, and you can't grow corn that way. And I says, I don't care. I says, we're going to have to find out how, because we can't grow it this other way. And I did find out how, and I'll give you more on that on Friday. But a big question in my mind, because the farm that I started farming on in Georgia was the worst case of soil erosion, or very close to it, in the county, which is kind of like our shires. And, I mean, I had gullies that were deeper than the creek on this farm. So my question was, well, can we rebuild our soils, and can we do it as fast as we lost them? Now, you look at this process that gave us the soils that we have, and it didn't just take millions of years, it took billions. And a billion is 1,000 million. So, no, we can't rebuild the soils quite that fast, even if we did catch a year where we have a dust storm and caught an inch of soil, or we had a irrigation. I've seen in the past floods up there in the Darling Downs, I've seen farms that were catching soil caught 6 inches in one flood event. But even so, we can't really build our soils, not all of them anyway. We can't build them as fast as we lost them. But we can come darn close in a lot of respects. I have seen soils that wouldn't support a pine tree. And if you look at our pine plantation, some of the soils they're on, that's saying a lot. Soils that wouldn't support a pine tree that I've worked on and built an inch of topsoil in the first year with minimal inputs, not just real expensive, and built 6 inches in the second year just by getting the biology back alive in the soil, opening it up, putting the trace elements that were deficient on, and getting the biology to work. And we can build soil a lot faster than most people assume. I can remember hearing that it took the forest 100 years to build an inch of topsoil. Well, I think in this country, and I think what's this program, CAM, Soils for Life? Isn't that what our former Governor General Michael Jeffrey has spearheaded? And I attended that event in Kealoha, and my wife and I, and Rhonda was one of the sponsors, I was one of the sponsors. And there were a lot of talented people there with a lot of solutions. Peter Andrews wasn't the only one that could attest to the fact that we can build soils. Within our lifetime, we can make some very degraded moonscapes into lush, fertile land. And I think it's something we are responsible for doing. I don't mean responsibility that this has to be a leaden weight on your shoulders. I think it's an exciting challenge. And I think responsibility is proactive. And I think it's our responsibility to leave the soils in good shape for coming generations. We have to rebuild this humus flywheel, and we can do that. And composting is one of the ways of doing it. One of the things that my research in agriculture has shown is that humic acids, which are made up of carbon and hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur, they're complexes made with clay and water, and phosphorus and potassium and various other cations adhere to these complexes. Now, if what you're looking for is a carbon to nitrogen ratio down around 10 to 1 or a little bit less, and you're also looking for a nitrogen to sulfur ratio down around 5 to 1 or maybe 6 to 1. And then a nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, nitrogen to potassium ratio, those are a little more flexible. Photosynthesis is what catches the carbon. The plant absorbs carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and heaven knows we don't have a shortage. So, what is necessary to convert that carbon dioxide into sugar is chlorophyll and sunlight. And chlorophyll is a large protein complex based around magnesium. And it's the efficiency of the transport of fluids in the plant, which is based on silica and boron. Boron is embedded in the silica walls of our capillary vessels, and it creates a hunger for electrons that draws the fluid through the capillary system. And so boron is what gives you sap pressure in the plant. Now, energy transfer is based on phosphorus and its cofactors of iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. And so all of those trace elements come into the picture too in maximizing photosynthesis. So nitrogen fixation depends on energy efficiency. Nitrogen fixation follows the catching of carbon. If we don't catch carbon, we're not going to get to nitrogen fixing because it takes so much energy. It takes roughly 10 units of sugar to make one amino acid. So it's very energy intensive. We've got to get good photosynthesis happening. And then we tune up the whole entire system by improving the sulfur, which is working with silica, the sulfur-containing amino acids. This pointer doesn't seem to work too awfully well. But your sulfur-containing amino acids, which are methionine, cysteine, and cysteine, they're found in the cell walls, connective tissues, and transport vessels of plants. And that's where you find the silica. So the silicon relies on the sulfur and the boron to work, and then calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and so forth are then transported into the plant. So we don't really get the use of calcium and magnesium and phosphorus and these other things until we've got the sulfur and the boron and the silicon working. But we do that, and then by improving these interactions with the soil food web and its humus flywheel, the humus flywheel is holding on to these things. It's humus that holds these elements in an insoluble but available condition in the soil. So we really have to build humus because that's where we get the momentum. And as we ramp things up, this is where in that soil that I was talking about, I built an inch the first year, but I built 6 inches the second year. I couldn't have built 6 inches in the first year. But going at it hammer and tongs, I built an inch in the first year, and it's like any of you ride a dirt bike or anything else like that, these 2-cycle affairs. You crack the throttle and it doesn't go anywhere very, very quick. It has to get on the power curve and then it'll tip you over backwards. Well, that's the same way basically with the soil. You have to get it going and get a little momentum and get the revs up before you get on the power curve. Now, in looking here at composting, this is a picture from Rhonda's composting operation. And you can see, I think it's very important to understand that there's clay, there's soil that went into this composting process. An awful lot of the composts that I test are deficient actually in soil. And that shows up on your compost test in the aluminium content of the compost, because aluminium silicate is what clay is. So you can see, if you're going to have clay humus complexes build up, that you're going to have to start off with some clay in there. Okay, is that my 5-minute warning? Okay. Now, from this condition back here, which is it's been heaped up with a front end loader and sort of distributed down there, then you have to mix everything up and get it working as a living organism. You're homogenizing it, or I think Rhonda was using a term called synchronization. Is that still the term? So you want to get moisture in there, you want to get everything working together as a living organism. This is like a big long worm. Okay, and it has to have a skin. I want to really emphasize that. All living organisms require a skin or a cell wall or some outer integument that holds their life energy in. You can imagine how long you'd last if you didn't have your skin on. You'd just leak everything away. So you really have to have some kind of a tarp. Some of the best compost I made back in my dairying days, we just took the plastic tarp off the silage pit and put it on top of the compost. Weighted it down with rocks. We had plenty of rocks. But without that skin on it, we wouldn't have made such incredible compost. So even though you're doing this with a turning machine, you're doing a rather fast compost. I think Cam said 12 weeks, and I would have said more like 16 maybe. But just the same, if you did it well enough, maybe 12 weeks is enough, maybe 10 is. Rhonda's saying 8 to 10. I think that's awfully fast. She must be really good at composting. So anyway, this is the point that you see it here, that it's become homogenized, and all of the life in the pile is like from end to end. You've got a living. It's starting this breakdown part of the cycle now. It has to break down before it can build back up. But it's breaking down, and you want to keep the moisture above 50%. I think the carbon dioxide at the base of the pile, down at the bottom in the middle. Keep it down below about 15%. And keep the temperature below about 65 degrees Celsius. And you'll go over those parameters a little bit some. But you want to keep working it to keep those things in that sweet zone. And you can get a lot of good activity real quick. If you don't put that tarp back on it when you turn it, then it'll dry out, and the last foot or so of it won't work. It'll lose its energy, its momentum. And this is finished compost. Look how much like soil that looks like. You start off with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But at the end, you should have a carbon to nitrogen ratio more like about 10 to 1, maybe even a little lower. And it should look like good soil. It should smell, because of the Actinomycetes, it should smell clean, fresh. And that's the sort of thing. Now, soil testing, I've gone over my program here a bit, but soil testing is a way of, and I've done total and soluble tests. We'll see more on Friday. This is my biochemical sequence that I use, and it tells you the hierarchy of how these elements work. And you'll see that these are in your program notes here. And the humic acid complexes are really key to holding on to both the moisture and the nutrients. So I think you won't read this on the screen this fast, but it's in your booklet, and this will give you an insight into it. I'm going to come back on Friday and give you a lot more material on the soil biology and nitrogen fixation. So one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that when you have one of these things missing, like boron is commonly deficient in our soils, if you have that missing, if it's not there at a high enough level, then you compromise the speed of photosynthesis because you've decreased the ability of your plant to transport the energy. So any one of these things here, manganese, copper, zinc, cobalt even, if we don't replenish those things in the soil and hold on to them with humic acids, with humified compost, then we're not going to get the sort of picture that we want. And I've got dairy farmers I've been working with in Victoria that had too much pasture this past winter and have to take a cut of silage off in order to get the spring flush to happen. They didn't have enough cows, and it grew like the clappers all winter. That's another thing about compost. Try to get your pH in the final product as close to 7 as possible, because higher ammonifies nitrogen and lower nitrifies it. Sometimes in doing that, I use about a kilo of lime per ton of compost in order to adjust that. And this is what you want to see in the end.
Thank you, Hugh, so much. Thank you. I'll get the